Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control. Tiffany Hoben, a former teacher and administrator, joins us today to talk about the evidence of systemic failure she found when combing through West Virginia's reviews of districts and schools. She found countless examples of persistent financial mismanagement, administrative dysfunction, failure to provide safe learning environments, and violations of state and federal law. Tiffany is really good at explaining how school systems break down. Fortunately, she's great at proposing solutions. Listeners can find a comprehensive list in her report, Special Circumstance Reviews as Diagnostic for Systemic Failure in West Virginia Public Schools. We talk about a few today, and Tiffany explains why it's important to offer educational freedom through West Virginia's Universal Education Savings Accounts, the HOPE Scholarship. Tiffany Hoben has 20 years of experience as a teacher and district and state administrator. She also served in the U.S. Army as a combat field medic with the Florida National Guard. At the time of our conversation, Tiffany was the Director of Education Partnerships and Strategy at the Cardinal Institute for West Virginia Policy. Soon after, she shifted to a new role as the Chief Academic Officer for the Department of War for Defense Education Activity. Tiffany Hoben, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, I'd like to start with your background before we dig into some recent research, a report that you've issued. What drew you to teaching? You're a former teacher.
I went to college for psychology and got a bachelor's in psychology. And it turns out there's not a lot you can do with that. So during that entire stint at college, I'd been substitute teaching and grown to love it. And it turns out you can be a teacher with a bachelor's degree in psychology. So I went to work at the high school that I graduated from and was in a community where I knew lots of people in the education world. And I just kept teaching. I fell in love with middle schoolers, which is weird, because they're weird. But I loved the middle school quirkiness. And in the state of Florida, which is where I was teaching, civics became a middle school course early on in my career teaching middle school. And I fell in love with teaching civics and government to middle school kids and early colonial U.S. history. I went to work at a district office, was a district administrator, and eventually worked at the Department of Education in Florida, working on the civics and government rollout under the DeSantis administration. And then from there came into the think tank world, and here we are.
Here we are. Well, our paths did not cross at the Florida Department of Education, but I found my time there extremely valuable to get that state perspective on just what are these 67 school districts up to, because there's different ways to be a district administrator, and some get it right and some don't. And there's different ways to be school board members, and some understand their responsibilities and some totally abdicate them. And so that's what you dug into in this work that you have put together for the Cardinal Institute. You looked at the West Virginia Board of Education's Special Circumstance Reviews.
I saw that there were 10 school districts that were in the state takeover situation, and I just went and looked at those investigations. I didn't conduct the investigations myself. I didn't go ask anybody any questions. I just looked at the published reports on the DOE's website, which were, publicly available.
And you made some recommendations, which we'll get to.
I did. I made some policy recommendations around what I discovered. So the special circumstances reviews, the State Board of Education either receives complaints or concerns from the community. Once they've determined that a special circumstances review is in order, then they have the DOE has a investigative department. Those folks go out and conduct an investigation to see where the districts are either compliant or non-compliant based on whatever information that they were given. And so once that's done, if it's determined that the school district needs to be taken over by the state, they'll issue directions, right, in an executive brief, which also goes on their website saying what the next steps are for that school district. I said, okay, just in the last 2 years, I'm not even going to go back further than that. If I took all these and looked at them, what would be like the common themes? What are the threads? Is there something that's going on everywhere? Or some kind of pattern that I could find where maybe we can offer some help in this one thing and prevent other school districts from going down the same road, right? And what I found was there were kind of three buckets of things that were common across all of these state takeovers. One was financial, either mismanagement, misconduct, fraud, some of it intentional, some of it not intentional. Academic issues and inconsistencies and how standards and curriculum are applied. And then finally, discipline problems where discipline was being totally mishandled and students were really in unsafe environments in a lot of cases. So those are like kind of the three big takeaways.
Give us some examples of what you were finding with the lack of financial discipline and the horrendous forecasting, as if there isn't like there's no future that they need to be thinking about responsibly.
Yeah, the primary problem was really ignoring the birth dearth, right? It was ignoring that enrollment is declining. And unfortunately, like West Virginia is a state that's just had a problem with this anyway. Our population has been in decline for a very long time. Out migration has exceeded in migration, maybe with the exception of like the last 2 years, I think. So this was a problem. And to points that you've made on other podcasts with other speakers, like universities knew this was coming. Smart school districts knew this was coming. Like it's a pretty simple graph to put together. Like how many incoming kids do we have? Can we continue to support this model? And do we need to look down the road and do 3, 4, 5 years worth of budgeting and figure out what this is going to look like? But when the funding formula is set up in such a way that it prioritizes buildings and staffing and transportation, you can ignore it. And then ESSER was a big, huge Band-Aid that just plugged that hole for so long. They could just ignore the fact that the population was decreasing, that there weren't as many students to serve, because there was this humongous influx of money that allowed them to be very flexible and spend however they wanted to. And I think now that that's gone, right, we're seeing the cries of underfunding, the sudden $8 million deficit. There were several counties in this report, $2 million deficit, $3 million deficit. Hancock County, which was the most recent one I was saying earlier, had an $8 million deficit. And a lot of times what they're saying is like, this is special education funding, right? Special education is bleeding us dry. But at the same time, West Virginia has the highest identification rate, one of the highest identification rates in the country. So one might ask, instead of just putting more money into this program, into special education, just continuing to feed the beast, you might say, how are you handling special education? Can we ask some questions about that? Like, why is our identification rate so high? Could that be attributed to something else? Oftentimes what people find is that money is not being used in the way that it's intended, or people think they can't spend it on something that they can spend it on, right? And so one of the things that's interesting to me is ESSER funding was flagged for building repairs, AC maintenance. You could take care of mold. Anything to make the building safer, more efficient, any kind of updates that was allowable under ESSER. And in many districts, they spent that money wisely and did those things. And in so many districts, they did not do those things. They hired more staff, and then the money goes away, and they can't afford the staff anymore.
A building update, that's a one-time expense that hopefully will prevent future expenses if you get ahead of maintenance issues that way. Hiring more staff or significantly increase staff salaries with temporary federal dollars, and that's what you're referring to when you say ESSER. These were temporary COVID-era federal dollars, and a lot of them, 190 billion nationwide. But if you use temporary dollars for a permanent cost, you're digging yourself into a financial hole. And as you're saying, that was combined with a total disregard for a birth dearth, for the fact that people stopped having as many babies in 2008. And then in West Virginia, you're saying population has been declining. And I would assume that hits the school age population particularly hard.
Yeah. And then the other things were like, one of the federal government actually did a big investigation on one of the districts in West Virginia because they were using money to like stay at resorts and go to restaurants and these kinds of things. And that's, obviously that's fraud. And one of the things I bring up in the paper is, how is that fraud and not something that's criminal? Like they knew what they were doing. Those buckets of money are earmarked for certain things. There's stuff that You worked at the Department of Education. Can you buy food and or clothing with any dollars that come to you from a state or federal account? Absolutely not. That's like one thing in education that everybody knows. You cannot buy food and you cannot buy clothes. And so these things were happening. And then, like one school district was at a very low, less than 50% seat capacity in their schools. And they started construction on a brand new school. And so now they've got recurring, because it doesn't take just 1 year to build a school. They've got recurring construction costs. Hancock County, the most recent county to get into trouble in West Virginia, it was some insane amount. Like the turf and lawn maintenance was like a $40,000 a month bill. And look, I like football as much as the next person. I think that it's cool when a community rallies around their football team and they have the money to do that kind of thing. But if you're in dire straits and you're thinking about, do we spend money effectively and efficiently on curriculum to try and increase our academic performance of our kids? Or do we sign a recurring ongoing contract for lawn maintenance that's going to cost an exorbitant amount of money? Sometimes hard decisions have to be made. And that's really what it comes down to in this budgeting question is where were the adults that needed to say, sometimes when you're budgeting, you have to make hard decisions. And every once in a while, you have to cut things that you don't want to cut. Sometimes you have to let people go. These are the problems that are faced. And it takes strong leadership to do that. And that we just didn't, in so many places, we did not see that happen here.
One thing I feel like I don't acknowledge enough is that clearly school administrators have very challenging jobs. These are complex operations. They are having to make really hard decisions. So I spend my days criticizing them, but I want to acknowledge they've got a tough gig. This is a tough job, but you have to make those tough decisions. And one of the things that stood out to me in the report and this is an elected school board member versus a district administrator, but a school board member said he would never vote to close the elementary school because it was a campaign promise. All right, well, that was a campaign promise that you made foolishly because the building was operating at 22% capacity. And so sometimes you're going to have to make those tough decisions and you're going to have to make those tough votes, even though you're going to be unpopular because it's financially foolish. 22% capacity, keeping a school open. You can't justify that if you're talking about the dire straits that you're mentioning. And for our DC listeners, an $8 million deficit might not sound like that much money because we operate in billions and trillions in DC. It's a lot of money to a West Virginia school district.
Yeah, it is. And like I acknowledge that too. I've worked at the school district. It is not an easy job to make, but there's a reason why a board is a board and it's more than one person. It's so that one person doesn't have to bear the entire responsibility of making those hard decisions. And the board has the financial responsibility. They hold the purse strings. And I think like School Boards for Academic Excellence does a really good job of explaining this. You hold the purse strings. You're supposed to be making the decisions about what the policy is and what happens. And then the superintendent executes those things. And the reason there's more than one person on the board is so that no one bears the total 100% responsibility for being the adult in the room. I think every school district or most school districts across the country are dealing with at least things that are similar to this, right? Because the ESSER cliff is happening for everybody. Discipline is this thing that's like bubbling all the time. We're talking about NAEP scores all the time, right? Like we have a reading crisis, right? And we have a math crisis. So I think that everybody understands on some level, the symptoms are all kind of different in different places, but on some level, most public schools are dealing with all three of these issues: finances, academics, discipline. I think the symptoms are manifesting quicker and more aggressively in West Virginia than they are in other states, but it's coming. That's like my crystal ball prediction for the day, is that I think West Virginia, no pun intended, could be seen as a canary in the coal mine for what's coming for some of these other districts if they don't play their cards right post-ESSER.
I appreciate you saying that. Marguerite Rosa from the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown was one of our first guests when we launched the Freedom to Learn podcast in order to say it's coming. But I think we are going to need to present these specific examples for people to believe us and to start taking responsibility and accountability. Before we move on from the financial category, there was a former maintenance director indicted for orchestrating a $3.4 million kickback scheme that defrauded the district through manipulated federal contracts. And I mentioned that because, again, 3.4 million in West Virginia is a lot. And let's not ignore fraud. Like this is happening. Don't pretend that it's not. Let's talk about the chaotic classrooms. You alluded to the discipline issues, and there were examples that you revealed that were found in these reviews where there was no teacher in the classroom. And these were on days when the investigators were coming. So everybody was probably on their best behavior, but they'd walk into a classroom and there wouldn't be a teacher there. Were there other examples that stood out to you?
The two middle schools in the review were the ones that housed the most discipline problems. A lot of the themes were discipline is applied inconsistently. There's some level 4 offenses. The way I explain it to people is it's something you would think would require the law. Aggressive behavior, like a fist fight, it's bringing a weapon to school, it's having drugs at school. It's something that's really very serious because it requires expulsion. So there's some lines you've got to cross there to be expelled from school. And typically they would involve at least having a resource officer involved. And what we saw was level 4 violations of discipline code, but no expulsions to match it, or not enough expulsions to match it, to avoid disciplinary problems that were happening in places like bathrooms. Bathrooms were locked. And to your point, the investigation crew showed up at a school and went into a classroom to do a random check, and there's no adult in the room. And they buzzed the office to see where the teacher is, and she's like down in the office dropping things off. And I don't know, like, as a percentage of the population, how many people have been inside of a middle school classroom since they were in middle school. But I'm just going to tell you right now, of all the kids to leave in a classroom by themselves, middle school is not the one to do it with. And so my questions become things like, look, what if you're the parent of one of the other kids in that class? Did you ever find out that the teacher left the room? Do you care that the teacher left the room? I care. I know middle schoolers really, really well. I don't want especially my daughter, a middle schooler, to be left alone in a classroom without an adult present. I want my child to have access to the bathroom all the time. I want discipline applied consistently so that my child can go to school and feel safe. And I think a lot of times we make this about the student. We have for many, many years made this about the student receiving the discipline. We have to be fair to them. We have to not, have bias or racist practices or whatever against the student who's committed whatever the disciplinary infraction is. And we've done that to the detriment of everyone else in the classroom. And we're not bothering to let parents know that there are students that are constant disruptions to their students' learning. And I think if parents had a line of sight, a clear line of sight into what their kids deal with in schools, especially middle schools in this country every single day, they would not be happy about it. If you or I, based on our age and our middle school experience, saw what happens in a middle school, we would be outraged. But a kid that started in kindergarten and then made their way now to 6th or 7th grade doesn't see anything unusual and doesn't feel any reason to go home and report to their parents that things are crazy in their classroom, because it's always been that way. And to them, that's nothing new. And it's really a problem, discipline, especially in our middle schools.
I wonder if one of the contributing factors was something that you identified, and that's chronic teacher absenteeism. We talk about chronic student absenteeism a lot since the COVID era because it doubled and is staying alarmingly high. But chronic teacher absenteeism leads to chaos in the classroom if you're talking substitutes on a regular basis or long-term substitutes. So that perhaps is a podcast topic for another day, but I appreciated you flagging that as one of the issues. We need to talk about that.
It signals something to the kids about the seriousness of not being there. Like, I think that there's just a lack of seriousness, both in our truancy issues and our teacher absentee issues.
Mhm. Can we talk about some reckless hiring practices that were identified? A sex offender who put it on the job application but was still hired. Like, how is that happening?
Yeah, this was one of the really kind of scary things about this when I started going through it. One of the school districts in West Virginia, a individual was hired to be like on maintenance, a maintenance staff worker
Okay.
who had something on their record. The superintendent was related to this person, so they knew that the report was going to come back with something on it, and they all just kind of put their heads down and hired this person anyway. In fact, the person was working on campus before the paperwork was complete, right before the hiring package was completely done. In other school districts, you have things like teacher transfers. So one
Mm.
teacher comes from a different district and moves into this new district, and they don't do a background check. Um, People were being hired that weren't credentialed. In some cases, the teachers didn't even hold a bachelor's degree, right? They were being hired for a teaching position. That's pretty standard practice in all 50 states. Like to get a teaching license, you have to at least have a bachelor's degree in something. And so we just saw this really inconsistent hiring pattern. There was a very little consideration given to looking into people's backgrounds, to finding out the reasons why they might be switching from one district to another, in the middle of a school year or over the summer. So, these are the things that invite bad actors into our school districts. These things are really dangerous, and they're just asking for people to be in our schools that we don't want with our kids.
I hope that school districts are going to start taking this seriously. It doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah.
You put a helpful feature into the report, which visually, in that you indicate what the graduation rate is in the
Mhm.
school districts and what the proficiency rates are.
Mhm.
And overall, West Virginia has significant challenges when it comes to proficiency rates. That mismatch is quite startling, though. Was that your intention to kind of show the
Yeah.
misalignment there?
Yeah, and that is not unique to West Virginia. It's just
Right.
pieces of information that haven't historically been put next to each other. I want people to look at these numbers and say, why is this so different? How can we be graduating 97% of our students, but only 30% of them are reading and writing at grade level or doing math at grade level? And, when NAEP comes out, people want to split hairs over whether NAEP is a good assessment, what does proficient mean, what is, right? Like all of these terms and definitions. It doesn't matter what tests you consult, the state reported data, the NAEP data. Does it really matter if it's 30% or 36%? At the end of the day, what we're talking about is for every 10 kids attending school, 3 or 4 of them are operating at grade level, starting from 3rd grade, 4th grade. So you're telling me by the time they get to 12th, they've not lost more ground? Are you going to try and make an argument that they've gained all that ground in all that time? It's not there, because you can look at the 11th and 12th grade scores and see they haven't gained any ground. And yet we're sending them out the door with diplomas. And I think that from a national perspective, what that means is, and this has, been over the last year, a lot of reporting on this, our colleges are saying these kids are not ready for college. Our workforce is saying, actually, these kids are not even really ready to be in the workforce. We've got kids that are suing their school districts because they graduated and they can't read. Like, this is a real problem. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the disconnect there? Who is in control of those levers, right? And who's in control of the graduation lever? Everyone at the school. Everyone at the school. Those are the only people that control the graduation rate. They decide the grades. They decide on grade promotions. They decide who walks out the door and who doesn't. And so then we have to start asking this question about, what is the incentive alignment on graduation versus what's the incentive alignment on these test scores, and who's probably telling the truth and who's not? What are we going to do about it?
So you're referencing some opportunities for improvement, and you make a number of suggestions in the report for things that could be done. So we've gone over the bad news, but I'd say the good news is this isn't hopeless. There are things
Yeah.
that can be done. So could you give us a sampling of some of your additional recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all common sense, but the three buckets, the main thing on the finance is acknowledge that ESSER is over and adjust your budgets accordingly. I think that if a school district is in receivership, it might be an opportunity to consolidate that district into another district and take advantage of getting rid of some of those higher level staff, especially in a state like West Virginia where all of our school districts are relatively small anyway. The boards have got to wake up and start asking questions about where the money goes and what the return on the investment is for the money that they spend. It can't just be blindly putting money into staffing. And the disconnect between hiring teachers and hiring just additional administrative staff and staff that's on school site, but they're not load-bearing staff. They're not people who actually have kids in a classroom all day. Those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking too. Like, is this really doing what we said it's going to do? Is it like we originally said, let's hire all these people to do X? Did you accomplish that? And if you didn't, it's time to cut some of those folks loose. On the academic side, I think this is probably a whole nother podcast too, but there's a lot of like scattershot curriculum and instruction stuff going on across all these districts, and there's not a lot of alignment. And some people might say, well, it sounds like you're arguing for like a common core situation. You want to take away teacher autonomy. I don't want to do any of that. I want to have, for the sake of transparency and for the sake of parents understanding what's happening inside classrooms, I just want the state to align on what it wants to teach and to teach strong content-based, vertically aligned standards, get a good curriculum. States have done this, Mississippi, Louisiana. There's all kinds of states that have modeled this really well, that aligns vertically from year to year and get everybody kind of moving in the same direction. There's something in between strictly mandated, scripted lessons and everybody does whatever they want to do. So I think we can find a sweet spot there. And then on the discipline front, we passed a bill here to help because we had elementary school teachers coming into the legislature like with bruises on their bodies, testifying and saying like, these kids are throwing chairs. This is like a real problem. Like, wow, we need help with discipline in elementary school. And so they passed this bill, and then the DOE wrote the policy, and the policy still contains all this language about trauma-informed care and counseling sessions and like pull the kid out of the classroom, and the teacher has to do weeks of documentation. The other students in that class can't afford weeks and weeks of deterrence while that student takes up 70 or 80% of that teacher's bandwidth and capacity to instruct the class, to keep things managed and in order. And that really, to me, that was why I left teaching in the end, because I had two students in one class that took up 80% of my bandwidth every single day.
Wow. And you were an experienced teacher at that point. You weren't even a new teacher coming in.
Yeah. Yeah. And there were these other kids in the classroom, and I could see in their eyes that they were starving. They wanted to engage with me. They wanted to read the books. They wanted to do the things. And I was constantly pulled away dealing with discipline issues. And what I should have been able to do was send that student out and have the administration say to the parents, your child has a right to be here. Yes, they do not have a right to infringe on the education of every other student in this school. And I know that the Obama era, dear colleague letter, was intended to like right wrongs. I don't denounce that in terms of like, if you're abusing your power, that should be checked. But I think that can be checked locally. I think teachers are generally good actors who are trying to keep some sort of semblance in their classroom. They don't want chaos. And that instruction to states on how to handle discipline took all the power away from the teacher, took all the power away from the school, turned it into a compliance issue. And the people who suffered from that the most were the kids that came to school every day to learn.
Tiffany, we would be remiss in not acknowledging that West Virginia has a Hope Scholarship Program that will be truly universal in the upcoming school year.
Hope is universal now. We passed our sort of like legislative mark. The 45-day rule drops away next school year, which is great because it means it's accessible to every single student in West Virginia, every single child in West Virginia, whether they've ever attended a public school or not. I wrote this paper because I think that our public school system has been in the past and can be again a force for good. It is a public good when it's done well. And there are lots of kids there, and those kids deserve a good education. They deserve to spend time with a teacher every day that cares about them and wants to share his or her knowledge with them. So I think it's worth reform. I think it's worth thinking about for public schools, like what do we need to do to make these better? But I also think that free markets work. And I think that a little competition is healthy. And our ESA program is allowing parents who are fed up and can't wait. Like, we can't wait for you to write standards. We're not going to wait for you to implement curriculum and create buy-in and retrain everybody. Like, they don't want to wait for you to figure it out. We should still try to figure it out. But for families that don't want to wait, accessing our ESA program means they get to immediately start remediating. They get to immediately start creating like the kind of environment where their kids are going to flourish and thrive and be happy and healthy and productive members of our society and stay in our state, which is ultimately what we would like for them to do. And so I think pitting public schools versus ESAs and vouchers and private and charter is really, it's just the wrong approach. We want every kid to have access to any and every program that's going to allow them to thrive and be successful. And the public school union-driven message that vouchers are defunding, right? Vouchers, even though we don't have a voucher in West Virginia, that the vouchers are defunding public schools and robbing funding from them is obviously nonsense, because we've documented all the ways in which they've done this to themselves, and we have to stop that nonsense. And we're all on the same team, and we want really good education for kids, and I think that's the attitude that we have to have going forward.
Well, I typically ask my guests to wrap us up with a school choice myth, education freedom myth, or whatever topic we're talking about myth that bothers them the most that they'd like to dispel. I feel like you just tackled the quote unquote vouchers, defund the public school. Is there anything else that you'd want to tackle today?
Particularly for lawmakers and people who think about policy. We tend to get kind of like siloed in our favorite area. If I had a favorite area, it would probably be academics. That's what I would want to talk about all the time. I don't want to talk about money, but finances and academics and discipline are all a braid. And when you braid something together, every strand has to be strong and aligned in order for the braid to do what it's supposed to do. And I think that those three things go together, and there's a danger in only thinking about finances or only thinking about discipline, because all of those things drive each other and hold a school together, and they should be thought about as one piece altogether.
Wonderful. Well, Tiffany, thank you for your commitment to ensuring that students have high quality educational options. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn. Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.